a graph that basically shows the amount of hay waste going from top to bottom from 0 to 100%. And you go from basically left to right, and there are different types of feeding mechanisms. So if you go all the way to the right, you see basically it says no feeder. And you see a scatter of data that starts around 35%, goes up to about 97, with an average of 58%. So when you have no feeder and you just put a roll bale out there, on average, you're going to waste about 58%. If the hay was stored outside, there's going to be more waste because the animals are actually going to refuse the rotten stuff, okay? So, but if you provide some sort of containment, like a ring feeder right there has a nice tight cluster of data right around 20%, okay? And so that what this tells me is providing some sort of containment reduces the amount of hay waste, all right? So this shot right here, this picture right here is this feeding area, which is a wintertime feeding area, come spring. Okay, so now I have a couple of calves standing in a mud puddle, which is not good. And there is a huge amount of waste right there. And what happened was we actually asked the person in charge of the herd, asked the herdsman, he said, how many roll bales did you feed? And he said, a little over 100. And then the PhD calculated, and he said, you shouldn't have fed more than 50. But if you have a 50% waste, you have to feed twice as much, okay? So you have to feed them, let's say 6 roll bales in order for them to eat 3, all right? But the whole point of designing the round bale feeders or the round bale system, forage system, was to conserve the hay for a later period of time and also to save labor. But when you have to clean up all this stuff and there's all this waste, then I don't see where the labor saving is. All right, so here's a shot of some stuff that's at the Eden Shale farm. And that's also a point of this presentation is from here on, basically, I'm going to give you a presentation that's from data that I collected from the Eden Shale farm. If you don't have time to do anything, and maybe if when this COVID thing exits or ends or whatever, if you want to go and check out this farm, then you can see some of these practices and some of this stuff that's up there. So this is a feeding area before I got to it. So they pugged it up pretty good. You got soil that's running down the hill, manure running down the hill. You see some wasted hay. This is on our side of the fence. And so what we have done is we have torn up our side of the fence to basically feed concentrated diets into these portable bunkers. And you can see the track marks from the truck where we redded it up pretty good. But if you look at the difference of the cattle side of the fence versus our side of the fence, there's a huge elevation difference there of at least a foot, okay? So that topsoil is basically gone. It's not at the bottom of that hill. It's in the Mississippi River, okay? It's in the Gulf of Mexico by now. All that topsoil is gone. So the only thing that's going to grow here is a bunch of bare patches and cockleburs and crabgrass, if you're lucky. But it's just compaction and a lot of mud, okay? All right, we'll skip this. So basically what I did was I came up with the system of basically doing the fence line feeders, which is basically you just operate off of a farm road. And there's no reason to get off the tractor and open a gate and get back on and then figure out where to feed, because these fence line cubbies basically make it easy. You just basically drop the feed in the system without having to open a gate or get off a tractor. So we did some of these up at Eden Shale. Here's one with a roof, without a roof. Here's one that's made out of wood as opposed to the metal panels. Here's one that's out of geotextile fabric and grid, plastic grid. Here's one that's just out of geotextile fabric and rock. This is actually a 3-section hay ring where we take one of the sections out and bolt the other 2 in between 2 8-foot posts. And so if you bought 2 feeders, 2 round bale feeders or ring feeders, now you have 3 of these that you could create. And again, there's not much of an interest in opening gates. This is right off the road. But on the other side, on the cattle side of this, we have what we call all-weather surfaces. All that area right there is basically it's hardened with geotextile fabric and rock, or it's hardened with rock and plastic grid, or it's in concrete, which is essentially indestructible. And here they are looking at the other way, where I got portable bunkers here in between the hay feeders, so I can use the same heavy traffic pad to feed hay as well as concentrated diets. So I'm using the same site to do both activities, okay? And then there's a windbreak across from the cattle to protect them while they're eating, and then after they eat, they can split. Here's basically about 12 inches of wasted hay, and this photograph was taken in the spring. You can see that the seed is germinating there, but you can also see that there's a minimal amount of waste. On the left-hand side, the cattle took it all the way down to the concrete, okay? So there's very little waste, and I don't really consider what's inside the rack as waste, because if they drop it inside the rack, they still have the opportunity to eat it. But what's on the outside of the rack is also waste. So this is the outside. This is also taken in the spring because you can see the leaves on the trees, but there's very little residue as far as wasted hay, not even really that much as far as manure buildup there as well. And this is all by design, okay? And so again, and going back and looking at some data, there was a scientist that basically looked at the amount of hay wasted using different feeding systems. So they evaluated a cone feeder, a ring, a trailer, and a cradle. And all the body weights are the same. What you want to look at is come down about 5 lines, and it says hay waste percentage. So with a cone feeder, you're wasting around 3.5%, 6.1 with a ring, 11.4 with the trailer, and 14.6 with a cradle feeder. You also want to look at intake per cow based on the body weight percentage. Basically, all these cows are basically eating 1.8%, rounded up to 2 if you want. So they're going to eat 2% of their body weight, and that's what they're going to do. But it's the design of the feeder that causes the waste, okay? So if you want to put logistics to this and also money, then here's the table for that. So this is counting in the amount of waste that these cattle create basically on these feeders. So if you would normally feed 3 round bales to a cow over a winter feeding season, with the waste included, instead of feeding 3, you're going to feed 3.11 with a cone, 3.2 with a ring, 3.4 with a trailer, 3.5 with a cradle. But look at the no feeder column. If you do not have a feeder, instead of feeding 3 round bales, you're going to have to go into that gate and feed 7, over 7, which means you're getting on and off the tractor, you're opening up gates, and you're rutting up fields, okay? And you're wasting time. If you could get a round bale for 25 bucks a piece, let's just say you could, if you can do your own math if you want. But instead of feeding 3 row bales at $77 without a feeder, you're looking at $178. So there's a difference essentially there of $100 per cow per feeding season by just providing some sort of containment, okay? Now, buddy of mine's driving down the road and he takes this picture, okay? Is this a winter feeding area? Yes, it is. Is it wintertime? No, it is not. Is that a historic winter feeding site? Yes, it is, okay? So let's just pretend there, okay, look at all that waste. So let's just pretend that basically there's 12 cows there, which means that I can provide some sort of containment, which means I'm going to save $1,200 the first year I buy a ring feeder, but I had to buy the ring. I can get a ring for $200. So the first year I'm going to save $1,000, and I'm going to save $1,200 every year after that, as long as the integrity of that ring lasts. But I'll ask you something else. Why do you need to go into the field to feed? Why can't we just put in a fence line feeder and just feed from the road and not have to go through a gate? Why don't we put a heavy traffic pad around that feeder so we don't create any mud, okay? So these practices basically compound on one another and they build on one another. So when I think of feeding, I think about efficient feeding concepts, which means that feed should be moved as little as possible from the point of production to the cow's mouth. Feed should be moved in bulk. Feed should be self-fed, and feed should be consumed with as little waste as possible. These are your goals, okay? And these are the standards, okay? Now, here's an aerial photograph of where those fence line feeders were, right off the road. You can see the woods to the other side. Now, the hoop barns up there on the upper left are basically where the hay is stored. So how far do I have to drive to put hay into these fence line feeders? You need to think to yourself, not very far, right? But the farther that distance becomes, all right, or is, the more dysfunctional this design is, all right? So you don't want to have any distance of driving at all, but the lesser is better, okay? Then I'll skip, well, actually this right here, I zoomed out on this because one of the design flaws with this is where the cubbies are, is basically there's a gate right there and there's a 2-hole water that's right there. Well, when you got food and water in the same location, they won't leave, okay? So what we did on this image right here in that upper middle part of there, you can see kind of like some straw and stuff like that was got spread. We actually developed a spring right there and set up a tire water that's in between 2 fence lines. And the point is to get the cattle to move. We want to motivate them to do their normal motivations. So I want them to eat and then leave and go get a drink of water. But if water and food is right there, there's no reason for them to leave, which means I have more manure to clean up. But by motivating them to leave, I get less traffic, I get less manure to clean up. All right. So what this is basically a layout for feeding animals. This aerial view is showing you basically, I'm going to go from, get a tractor, I'm going to go from the hoop barns, I'm going to go to the fence line feeders, and I'm going to feed, and I'm going to drive back and forth. This is called a layout. All right. This is also a layout, and this is a really, really old one. Okay. But what I want to show you is the red line that's squiggling through there is this producer's path that he takes to feed. Okay. And that looks pretty crazy to me. All right. But the crazy part, you haven't even seen the crazy part yet. In the middle of that string, it basically says repeat 8 times in a text box. Repeat 8 times. To me, that's really crazy. But what happens is basically a person like me or a county extension agent basically comes to this farm and says, look, let me help you with changing your layout. It's the same farm, okay? You're just going to change how you do things. And how they change it is basically to this. And now you see that he's not doing all those steps 8 different times. His path has actually been reduced. And what he's doing is in this example, is he is actually feeding with a fence line feeder. And it says hardcore, which is basically a heavy traffic pad that's made out of geotextile fabric and rock, or it could be made out of concrete, or it could be made out of rock and grid. The point is that area where you're going to get all that traffic has been hardened so you don't get animals that create all that mud and sink. But it's basically, it's just basically changing the layout. All right. So on changing the layouts, I'm going to show you a video. All right. And what this is basically what I call a time motion study. Okay. So I'm going to time this producer basically feeding a round bale of hay the way he normally does, starting right now. So right there, when he passes that post, I start a time clock. All right. And so he's going to drive around here with his tractor and one roll bale. And he's going to stop over here. We're going to have a little glitch in here, but the time clock is still running. But an interesting point here is he's got to turn around. He's got to make a 3-point turn. He's got to open up this gate and unlock it. And he's got to back down this alleyway because he's got to back down it because of how the gates swing the opposite way than what he actually needs. So what's going on here is there's a guy in the pin in the right. And so he's getting ready to open the gate. But his role is also to watch out for this escape that's coming up behind him. Okay. And so this process right here takes 2 people to do. You got to have one tractor driver and you got to have one guy opening the gates and watching out for escapes, which we almost had. And so now he's going to lift this roll bale up and he's going to pop it in this ring feeder. And now this roll bale is sitting in 6 inches of quagmire. Okay. And it's going to rot. Okay. And it's going to sop up some of that manure and stuff, and you're going to have more waste. That roll bale is also sitting outside, which means it's going to get rained on during the winter and we're going to lose nutrient value. All right. So what I did was I said, okay, here's your layout. Now let's do my layout. I want to change things, and we're going to time this one too. Now, the first trip, what I just showed you, took 2 men, and it took 4.5 minutes to feed 1 round bale. Okay. And so now we're doing this again, starting from the same location, timing it. We're going to come around, it's pretty much the same thing. But now we're going to get on this artifact of a road that hasn't been used in years, okay? And what we're going to do is I punched holes or cut holes in the side of this barn so he can take that roll bale right there, and he just drives up and basically just drops it right in that little cubby, which is basically a fence line feeder. Now, this operation takes 1 man, okay? And it only took him 2.5 minutes, okay? So these are 2 different layouts, all right? So there's that. So in comparing these, 1 worker at 2.5 minutes versus 2 workers at 4.5 minutes. And basically this is a cost benefit analysis. There were 72 bales that were fed at this particular barn. If I take, all right, 1 worker, 2.5 minutes, I got a tractor operator on a tractor, so that's $30 an hour. 2 workers, basically what that's going to be is a tractor operator and a tractor at $30 an hour, plus a second worker at $10 an hour. So there's $40. So it's the difference between $30 and $40. But when you do the math of 2.5 minutes versus 4.5 minutes, what you see is the time it would take to feed 72 bales takes 1.5 hours doing it my way, takes 5.5 hours doing it their way. If you do the money on that, that's a difference of $45 per winter feeding season versus $220, which is a 5-fold increase or a 500% difference, okay? And that 5-fold is important. I need you to kind of remember that. But also what's going on here is the hay is inside versus outside. I'm going to have more waste with the hay on the outside versus the inside, but I'm assuming that all of it's the same, okay? Now, also, there's no gates to open during my system, but there's several gates to open during the other system, and there's a couple of 3-point turns that have to, that have to be done in there too. But when I talk to producers about opening gates, it seems like there's an endless amount of time trying to open and close gates. And I've been on one farm, and I was with Philip Canapa, and we went to this one farm. It was a previous dairyman, and he was the only person that I've ever seen that had a gate that swung and closed freely, okay? Normally, we're dragging gates open and we're dragging them closed. I have some producers that have to open anywhere between 4 to 20 gates to do feeding of round bales for that particular, day, all right? So gates can be a nuisance or they can be a benefit. Now, here is the picture of basically the cubby, the fence line feeder that's actually inside the barn. This is a 2-row bale cubby. It's on concrete, it's raised up. I got a concrete apron around it for the foot traffic. But so this allows me to now have that row bale that's actually in the barn and not getting any weather on it. And nothing is done in isolation. So another thing that I did was I renovated the floors by doing some different methods and systems of heavy traffic pad. This is one of those plastic grid systems that looks like this. And then basically you backfill it with rock, and then basically a scraper blade can just go across this without hitting anything. There's no digging into the floor. You're not hauling away your rock because you can't reach it, okay? This is another method. This is what I call, these are tire cylinders, which means these are recycled tires. And what they do is they cut the sidewalls out, which leaves you with what's called a tread cylinder. So you lay these tread cylinders down, which basically takes up about 8 or 9 inches in elevation, which is normally what we need to remove to put in a heavy traffic pad. And then basically what you do is you just backfill these tires with rock. And again, now when that scraper blade goes across there, it's not going to cut in to that 1.5 inch thick round ring of tread that I've made this matrix out of. All right. So again, nothing is done in isolation, because when I did that fence line feeder, that gave me the opportunity to modify the flooring in the barn, which improved the ventilation because I cut sides in the side of the barn, which improved how much light came in. I added a manure storage structure, which wasn't there before. I added shade structures to that area. There was already a handling facility that was pre-existing. So what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to combine some of these components of beef cattle production into a system, all right? All right, so now we're shifting gears, all right? We're shifting to something else. Barns, okay? We have a lot of tobacco barns on our topography that are basically just full of junk where we store stuff, if you want to call it that, on the floor. And storing things on the floor is the most inefficient way of storing anything, okay? But this is what we do, all right? So here's a barn that's on the Eden Shield farm. Here's one of those old barns that's not making a contribution to the operation, okay? And it's got junk storage in it, same as anybody else. And so basically I said, all right, we're going to move this stuff out of here. I want this center alleyway, all right? Because what you can do is you can take these old tobacco barns, and a tobacco barn, as an example, was programmed essentially to cure and process tobacco. That's what its job was. But you can reprogram structures to do other things, okay? Sometimes it's easier than said than done, but there it is. So this is basically that tobacco barn, and here is the center alleyway. And what I'm doing is basically I'm developing a system or showing you a drawing or a rendering of how we can take that center alleyway and store hay in it, but also create a self-feeder where the animals basically come up on one end and basically eat all that hay that's in there. And so that hay is actually stacked in this alleyway right now. It's too high, and I've got a feed panel in there, and basically that feed panel or that feed barrier basically slides on tracks, which means that the animals that would come up to this opening to eat have access to the entire 30 bales that's stored in this barn, all right? So the beauty of this is that we're going from a hay field, okay, and we're moving the hay one time, and we're putting it in a structure, and we're peeling off the strings and we stacked them too high, because what's going to happen is gravity is going to drop that second story bale down into that hole. But we've only moved the hay one time. So, and we did that in June, but come January, all right, these cattle are going to come to this barn and they are going to self-feed themselves, okay, with stored hay. So the hay is inside, which is going to reduce the spoilage. You don't have to move it more than once. It's about a 13-foot wide opening. Normally cattle need about 2 linear feet to eat, which means I can feed about 7 cows with this feeder, but that's not right, because that hay is there 24/7, which means you can have groups of cattle coming and eating, and basically they can eat in shifts, which means that you can multiply that width that we have. Basically, we can serve 3 times as many cattle there, or around 21 cows, ballpark, okay? And the structure, just to build the hay barrier and the, put in the rack and the track and all that kind of stuff, I spent about $3,500, but then I spent a little bit of extra money on 300 feet of fence, which I'll show you. I also put in a heavy traffic pad so they could stand on gravel and fabric and eat, rather than standing on soil, which is going to fail and create mud. And so that's basically what I did. Okay, but the thing is what you got to realize is that you might think, well, that's a lot of money. Well, nothing, again, is done in isolation. Okay, so this image right here is aerial photographs, and what it's showing you is down on the bottom in the kind of the center there is that barn that I'm showing you. And it's in what you can see is field 66, okay? Field 66 is a hay field. So that hay is being harvested right there, and it's being placed in that barn that is in the same field. I added those 2 yellow lines, which is basically about 300 feet of fence, to basically cleave off about 1.5 acres of that hay field to make a hub. And that hub is basically in the center of 2 other pastures. So basically I've got access and connection. But what I can do is I can split up this herd that this farm has, and they can feed one group over there, and I can feed another group right here. And so basically what it does is it creates a hub. Okay, so here it is again. So basically there's that barn. It's right off the farm road. So I got a road that leads to it. The blue square on the bottom on the south end of the barn is where the cattle eat, which means I can load this barn if I need to several more times without having to open a gate. Okay, I did the fencing. There's the existing gates right there. So basically this creates a hub. All right. So here's the thing about buildings, because I believe that most producers don't have a lot of, put a lot of value into buildings, which is why they end up being junk storage. Okay. But a building, when considered as a static structure, can only serve as shelter or storage space, whereas its real value is measured in terms of what it can contribute to productive capacity through planned arrangement, control of the environment, and facilities for storage and conditioning, management, sanitation, and saving of labor. That might be really confusing to you all, but basically this is, when I go up to a producer and I go, what do you think a barn is for? They usually have to think for a while, and they'll respond with the word shelter, okay? Which is correct. A barn is shelter. But to me, a barn does about 8 things. And the last thing on the list is shelter. There are a whole bunch of things that barn can do for a beef cattle producer to add to the productivity of that operation, okay? So now we're going to shift, and basically we're going to talk about the science of where, all right? So we talked a little bit about farm layouts, okay, as far as the feeding layout. Where's the barn? How you moving? What's your path? But you really need to look at the entire farm, okay? And a farm layout is basically a relation of the fields, the gates, the lanes, the waters, the roads, etc., to the buildings, and to the buildings to each other. It's how the inside of the buildings are laid out as well, okay? And a desirable layout is necessary in order to economize labor and enhance the value of property, all right? So the problem is that farm infrastructure is often given too little or no consideration at all, which usually results in an arrangement that is neither simplistic or systematic for labor efficiency or livestock production, okay? So this is the farm. This is the Eden Shale farm, okay? And it is a map, all right, of that farm. And this is one of my things. When I go on a farm, or when an extension agent says, hey, come to my county, I want you to come see a producer. Typically, I will tell them to get the producer to provide a map Most producers don't have a map, but I love maps, and you'll see why, okay? Maps allow me, again, to look at a farm from a different perspective, a different view. In this case, we're looking from the top down, okay? So the farm boundary is outlined in red. The green areas are pastures. You can see some of the areas that aren't colored are wooded areas, woods. The beige is basically hay fields. You can see some black lines in there for roads, okay? So getting rid of some of that clutter, what you've got is these are all the hay fields that are marked on this farm, okay? And those hay fields are represented by those yellow dots, or the colors of the field, but also the yellow dots represent the yield, okay, as far as how many bales they get off of that particular field, okay? So the size of the dot indicates what the yield is. But all the hay that's produced on this farm goes to a centralized storage structure, which is basically that black square that says hay storage. All of the hay goes to that storage structure, which is those two hoop barns, okay? But here is an image also showing yellow circles. This is where the hay is fed, okay? And the size of the circle indicates how much hay is fed at those locations, okay? And then when you overlay the two of them, so basically you're going to start in a hay field, which is going to be a green circle, and you're going to end up in feeding the hay, which is going to be a red circle. That's where you're going to stop. But what I want you to notice is this, okay? When when this farm is harvesting that hay and taking it to that storage structure, they are literally passing up the feeding sites that they're going to haul that hay back to. So what they're doing is they're backtracking. They're having to, they're going over the same ground more than once. They are wasting time, okay? And so when I brought this up to some producers, and I'm like, you're driving your tractor too much, this one literally snapped at me and said, I like driving my tractor. It is therapy for me. Well, that's great, because normally I would bill you for $30 for an operator and a tractor to pay for my infrastructure. But if it's for therapy, then I'm going to charge you $300 an hour. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. But the thing is this is what I think is going on from an engineering standpoint. We have bad farm layouts. And what we are doing is we are compensating for that layout by driving a tractor to close that distance. Okay. When a building that might already be existing on that farm has the capacity to close that distance itself. Okay. So these, it's the same thing. Here's that farm again, and those blue cows represent where they feed, okay? And it's also listed in minutes to make a round trip. So to go from that hoop barn to feed at some of those locations and come back to that feed time or that hoop barn is actually indicated there in time, all right? And so I've got some sites that take 35 minutes. There's one that takes 30. There's several 26, 24, so on and so forth, okay? So what I've done is basically I've looked and just trying to narrow this down for you. What we've got is the same farm, and we're looking at basically where the hay is produced and where it is stored. But you can see that red dot that's basically has a white circle around it. There is a tremendous amount of hay that is fed at that location. And you got a hay field that's in close proximity to it. But this is what we've done. This is where that large bale feeder is. And now we put a hoop barn over it. So we feed hay here. But now we have a storage structure where we can store the hay, peel off the strings, and we don't have to touch it or move it again. And the cattle will self-feed themselves this hay come wintertime. And again, if we need to reload this magazine, we can do it from our area, and we don't have to open up any gates, and we don't have to get in with the tractors, okay? All right, so here's the map again. Let's see, what else was I going to show you? Okay, this area down here, all right? So the green circle, that's a large hay field that produces a lot of hay, okay? But that hay is pretty much it's shipped out and it goes to the storage structure. Well, not anymore, okay? Because what we've done here is that barn, that alley barn feeder that I just showed you is in that hay field. So now we're going to take the hay that's produced in this field, store it in this field, and feed it out of this field without harming the pasture where the hay field is, okay? And so then in looking at this, because I told you it costs $3,500 just to build, the feed barrier and put up that track, all right? I showed you, and so here's some data. Looking at 30 bales, it says 3 trips, 2.55 hours. So in that situation, to feed 30 bales of hay is going to cost me $21.60 per bale to move that hay. And this is with an average cost of 20 minutes. I showed you some of those feeding sites that were 35, okay? So there's $21.60 per bale to move it. There's another $20.50 from that other location. And then you're looking on down. But when you go down to that green bar, it says $10 per bale. That is what it is costing me to move that hay from that hay field and put it in that barn, to move it only one time. Okay, does that make sense? And you're done. Versus these other sites. So to feed 30 bales at that barn site that I just showed you, that alley barn feeder, it's going to cost me $300 to feed 30 bales. Versus these other sites that I've showed you, and some of them I haven't, it's going to be over $650, okay, on average. So that's a savings of $350, okay? These other sites right here that's got the circle with the white circle around it, there's 3 feeding sites right there where a lot of feeding goes on, and those feeding sites are in close proximity to those hay fields. But in the existing system, they're passing up those feeding sites to go to storage, and then they're backtracking to go back to those feeding sites. But if you look at those feeding sites, there's those 3 feeding sites, which are 3 barns, okay? Now, in looking at this data for this particular farm, they fed over 300 bales last year. And when they fed those bales, they were feeding 2 of them at a time, okay, on average. Versus the 2 structures I just showed you, basically the barn alley feeder and the large bale feeder feed 30 bales and 32 row bales consecutively, each time, okay? And also in analyzing this data that I looked at, of those 300 bales, 88% of the bales were fed around a barn or a structure, like in these structures right here. So one of the things we're done is basically, instead of hauling that hay all the way, I'm like, well, why don't we store some of it right here where you actually feed it? And then here's another barn that's got a feeder that's in the foreground, but in the background, there's plenty of room to store hay in there to basically utilize. And so you're not driving very far to reload this structure, and it doesn't take you very much time, all right? And so what you can end up with is basically a system like this, where basically you got a winter feeding area, and this is also where the feed is stored, and possibly even bedding in this case. And this drawing is like tremendously old. And here's another one. And that bottom right-hand corner basically shows you, again, a large bale feeder in this situation. But in both of these situations, what you're doing is you're combining the components of beef cattle production. You're combining feed storage, manure storage, bedding storage. You have shelter, you have your handling facility, you have your water sources. You're combining all of this stuff to create a system where things work more efficiently, okay? There was 2 other sites that where hay was fed, and you can't even really tell where they are, but there's 2 circles right here, 2 white circles that show those 2 feeding areas. The one off to the right, you can see a green circle, and you can see a tiny little red dot. And then off to the left, you can also see the white circle with a tiny little red dot right there. Well, those 2 sites to feed is tremendously expensive. And maybe that indicates that, wow, this is so expensive, maybe I need to do something to change this or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that there's not that much traffic that occurs right there because of the size of the dot. So not much feeding occurs. So maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to do anything in those particular locations. The one off to the right, the white circle off to the right, is also around in those wooded areas as well. And geographically, it's kind of isolated. It doesn't really flow well with the movement of traffic of rotational grazing across the whole farm. So maybe we don't want to do anything there anyway. But the point is that maps are an awesome tool for basically showing you relationships and connections and patterns. And then hopefully it's also going to show you where you have problematic areas, and also it can also show you the solutions to those as well. All right. So on this particular farm, okay, just kind of recapping, I showed you a method of feeding at the barn where basically they were feeding out on the open concrete, and I was feeding underneath of the barn. And there was a difference of $45 versus $220, which is a 500% difference. Okay. But it's a difference of $175. Okay. I showed you the barn alley feeder of basically it's going to cost you at least, or in this situation, it's going to cost them at least $650 to feed someplace else, but it's going to cost them about $300 to feed there, which is a savings of at least $350 at that one site. So that's 2 different feeding sites on this farm. What I want you to think about is there are 13 different feeding sites on this farm. And I talked about that 500% or that 5-fold difference. There is research out there that shows not only a 500% difference in similar farms, similarly operated farms, similarly sized farms, having a huge difference in efficiency of 500%, 700%, 1,300%, 2,000%, and 4,000%. Okay. So just think about that. It might take me, let's say, 10 minutes to feed a roll bale, but looking at this difference here, it might take someone an hour and a half. Okay. It's inefficiencies on the farm. All right. And then, so the whole point of this is basically simplification. All right. It's the systematic development and use of an easier, quicker, and more economical ways to do the same job. All right. Labor savings is mainly a matter of simplifying and possibly eliminating transportation of materials. It's also eliminating opening gates and getting off the tractor and having to figure out where you're going to put a round bale. All right. You can do feeding without getting off the pavement, which means you don't need a front wheel drive or a front wheel assist tractor because you're not getting out in the mud. Okay. And it also, these things basically, they reduce travel distance. Okay. Now, the systems that I've showed you, all right, are called labor saving designs. Okay. Typically, labor saving designs do not increase your profit. All right. The only way they're going to increase your profit is if you have the ability to expand your herd, because now you can manage more cattle with less time. Okay. Labor saving design practices also eliminate drudgery. They provide for what we call continuous production. So continuous production to me is they have 30 bales they can eat versus hauling 2 bales every other day. Okay. So that creates an automatic operation that does not need supervision. It creates simplicity. All right. And in some cases with the heavy traffic pads and the way you design these feeders, you get better animal performance and quality. But these designs are not supposed to drastically lower production cost per animal. It allows you to manage more animals. And then maps, again, are a great way of changing or getting a different perspective on things. They demonstrate patterns, connections, and relationships. And so the whole point of this is by looking at this and evaluating this and doing time motion studies and stuff and trying to show you things that are invisible to you, is that the hope is that the next time you see your farm, maybe you see it with a different pair of eyes and you can notice some problems and issues that can be rectified that can make your life easier as well as the lives of your cattle. And that's all I got.
Any questions? Hey, Doc, the next time you come up to Lewis County, I got to show you what a farmer can do with some garage door springs and some ramps.
Okay. Okay. Those springs can be dangerous. You can snap an arm with those things.
So far, we haven't done that.
Okay, good. Any questions on anything? You can chat. You can say something out loud. If you're thinking it, I guarantee you someone else is. If you don't have any questions, I'd like to know if this is useful for you. If this was, and you can say either way. It won't bother me at all. But it's something that's interesting to me, and I thought I would share it with you because I'm in the process of doing a lot of construction work up there right now, and to me this is interesting. So anyway.
I think it's really interesting actually being able to transform tobacco barns that have just become kind of wasted space is really helpful.
Correct. What kills me about old tobacco barns is I mean, we put columns in them to get that narrow space. If we had a free spanning barn, you know, I would be in heaven because of all the different things that I can do because the flexibility that gives to me. But when we put these columns in there, it hamstrings me on what I can do, and it hamstrings you on the ability of how easy it is to clean out the barn because you have these columns that are in the way. But definitely it takes something that's obsolete on the farm and can convert it into something that's productive. And also at Eden Shale, I mean, just because the barn's got a roof, I can harvest the water off of it and use it to water the cattle. I can do all of these, I can make that static structure that most people don't look at and ignore. I can make it an essential piece of the production of that operation, because the way Kentucky works is we don't put these barns together like we do in the Midwest and upper Midwest, where we have a farmstead that has, the whole operation, the granary and everything. In Kentucky, we got a barn that's over here, we got a barn that's over there, but these barns can end up being what I call hubs, and typically they can allow you to manage 80 acres of animals with that barn that's no longer being used. But anyway.
Dr. Higgins, this is David Appleman. A lot of the presentation tonight also leaned toward safety for our producers, and
Correct.
many of our producers, such as myself, we're getting older, and we need that in our operation. Can you talk a little bit more about the safety and how some of these can help?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole entire point of this, is to eliminate the need to get in with the cattle to feed either concentrates or to feed the hay, and also to eliminate any kind of decision making from the standpoint of where is this round bale going to go once you get in through the gate. I've torn up this area, now I'm going to move it over here so I can work, but you end up tearing up more areas. But yes, safety is a huge component of it, because again, you're eliminating drudgery, you're eliminating the need to get on and off the tractor. You also got to think, in the wintertime, we're bundled up in Carhartt gear. You're cold, you're stiff, you're not moving that fast. And so all of these systems, like the self-feeders, like 30 bales of hay stored in a barn, and if you had 25 cows, you won't have to fire up a tractor for a month. Does that make sense? I mean, and so, and again, not going out in the field, not tearing all that up. But yes, I've got lots of producers that have been knocked down. I've known some over the years that have gotten killed, but there's no reason to go in with the cattle. There's none. And so, yeah, that's a safety thing. And also creating some of this automation.
Hey, Doc, we got a question in the chat.
Okay.
What type of grid system have you found to work well in reducing the amount of mud in feeding areas?
So it all depends on how much money you want to spend. So concrete is by far the cheapest, most durable, cleanable surface that we have, but it's hard on cattle. Okay, if they stand on it for an extended period of time, you've got to have the right amount of abrasion on that concrete to basically not have cattle slip and fall, but you can't have so much abrasion that you grind the foot down to the heel. The grid systems that I use, the plastic, I like those a lot. They're installing them is just as expensive as concrete, but for me, the floor drains. Okay, and so let me just touch on that for just a second. Again, I see things and I'm like, why do we do these things? Why do we pour concrete flat, as an example? All right, because flat concrete doesn't drain. And if you get cow manure on it, then it's going to be sloppy. Okay, so there needs to be a minimum of a 2% slope to get water to drain. If it's got manure on it, it needs to be closer to 5. You can actually get, slurry manure to actually flow downhill if you got a 5% slope. But my point is that you need to provide a surface for cattle that's comfortable for them to get on, that's safe for them to get on, that's thermally comfortable as well. Because concrete, if you lay down on it without bedding, it'll rob the heat right out of you. And when animals lay down, a third of their body is in contact with that concrete. So a lot of your maintenance diet is actually going to heat up an animal that's being drawn down by concrete. So my point is having floors that drain, which is some of the stuff that I'm playing with right now with the grid system, with the tires, because those systems drain. And I think that's what we should do, not put in a floor that's flat, providing a surface that actually drains, but also maybe put in a subsurface system that allows that moisture to drain as well. Because Eden shale is sitting on what we call a frag pan, a clay pan. It's probably 12 to 18 inches down below the surface of the soil, which means it can't drain water. It can't bleed it. So you've got a water issue already that you have to address in order to provide a foundation for them to walk on that's not going to fail. So it all depends on what you want to spend. Concrete's Easily lasts 30 years if you place it properly. It's hard on cattle. It should have a slope on it. The grid systems are almost just as much as that. But the tire cylinder system, I paid $1 a piece for those tires. So that adds probably about 25 cents per square foot to a flooring system, which is nothing, okay? But I think that those tire cylinders, because of what they add as far as reinforcement to those gravel pads, would add significantly to the life of a normal geotextile fabric rock pad, which to me only lasts 5 to 7 years. So adding, buying those cylinders and installing those, which is fairly easy, and just backfilling them with rock, you're pretty much done. But again, you get drainage with those systems as well. There's probably more information than you wanted to know, but there you go. What else?
Any other questions? We got a lot of great thank yous. I love this one. I can't wait to share my information with my husband. So if you all implement any of these projects on your farm, please let us know. And if you have any thoughts or for next year, let us know that as well. But I kind of got ahead of myself on that one. If a couple housekeeping reminders, don't forget about next week. Email link will be sent out next Tuesday morning. We're going to be talking about grazing sticks and rotational grazing. And then the following week, we'll do animal herd health with Dr. Arnold. But other than that, if nobody has any more questions, Doc, thank you for your time. Ladies, we appreciate your attendance. If you have questions or think of stuff later, feel free to get a hold of your county agent and we can get the answers for you. We can get a hold of Dr. Higgins anytime. Doc, we greatly appreciate all you did tonight and spend your evening with us.
Yeah, thanks for letting me just share what was on my mind. You all take care.
Thank you all again. I will send out after the very last session, I will send out well, it's a survey, I guess, in a sense, to let us know how you've enjoyed each of these sessions. Also, to get ideas for what we can do for next year. So Dr. Higgins, he's great about giving us great updates every year or every other year we have him speak. So maybe it will be something to have him again for next year. So just be thinking of ideas, and we'll be sending out that survey after session 4. So thank you all again. Hope you have a good evening. And if you think of any questions for Dr. Higgins after you get off tonight, again, we're happy to help reach out to him for you and find out answers. So thank you all. Have a good one.